Many of you know that we have been blessed with the most stunning, beautiful mural since 1981 on this spot, although not always in this building. The mural that you saw as you were coming in to the sanctuary, which wraps around the outer wall of this sanctuary, and which was commissioned in 1981 and was in our original building from 1981 and was transformed and able to be brought here. And this is such a wonderful opportunity to learn much more about the artist and his work. And I am delighted to welcome Patricia Utermohlen, William Utermohlen, the artist's widow, who in her own right is an art historian, her focus being on art and industrialism. Patricia studied in London, later completing her MA at the University of Massachusetts. She has taught in London and abroad. For many years, she lectured at Syracuse University, the City Lit, Modern Art Studies at the ICA, and the Inchbald School of Design. Patricia continues to lecture on exhibitions, showing seasonally within London, and all her past lectures can be found online on YouTube under the Art in Its Time channel. Together with Patricia is Dr. Camilla Sotomayor, chosen family architect and writer, who helped with this lecture and the research into Judaic symbolism. I'd also like to welcome Simon Rees, William Utermohlen's nephew, who's an artist and jeweler, and who helped William Utermohlen during the construction of the mural. And also here, Robert Devchik, who founded GV Art London in 2005 and has been the UK agent for the Utermohlen estate since 2010. I also want to mention that there's a small exhibition of Carol Goldberg's picture in the library and other pictures of William Utermohlen in the Montefiore Hall. I hope you have had an opportunity to look at that exhibition, or will do afterwards. So I hand over to Patricia and Camilla.
Hello, all of you. The LJS mural was commissioned by Irvin Sellers to honor his late father, Jonas. The two people who were essential to the production of the mural were Rabbi David Goldberg and the artist William Utermohlen. I will begin with a brief biography of Bill, my husband, his early development, and the production of the mural, ending with his later work. Thank you. The first image you see is Bill's house in which he was born. Now, this is something, I'm sure you don't know Philadelphia well, but it's Philadelphia. But interestingly, it's South Philadelphia. This is enormously important. If I could remind you of not the East End now, because it's so fashionable, it's unbelievable. But remember the old East End. That is what South Philadelphia is. Almost entirely working class, involved with mostly first-generation Americans. In this particular case, it was an Italian neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Now, this was terribly interesting because Bill's family are German. He was the only German, they were the only German family. The result is the Italians took him to their heart, and his whole life he was besotted by Italy and everything that happened to it, because, sorry, I probably might sniff a bit today. And then what we're looking at is in the house in which he was born. The next one, I thought it was funny, I managed to find a photograph of the street. This is Hick Street, where he was, and you can see all the Italian group there. Now, this is very important for his development, because Bill something extraordinary happened to him. He won a scholarship to the most prestigious university, art university in America, and it's the Pennsylvania School of Art. It is the oldest one, and the important thing about it is that it's almost entirely devoted to the old traditional life drawing, lots of drawing. And he was frightfully lucky because he got a scholarship there. However, remember his background. Suddenly he's plunged into a totally different environment, mostly upper class. And believe me, if we think that England's class conscious, you should see Philadelphia. But he was in a totally different environment. And who knows what would have happened to him, but he was frightfully lucky because he had a very, very interesting teacher, a man called Walter Stumfig, and we'll see him next. Now, he was at the Pennsylvania Academy from 1959, from 1951 to 1956. Now, this sweet little picture of him there, he actually, while he was at the academy, he had to do his 2-year service, you know, that like Americans did, and he went to the Caribbean. He hated every minute of it, but it gave him something called the GI Bill of Rights, and this meant that he had a scholarship because his work was his career had been interrupted. He had a scholarship to go where he wanted to, and he decided to come to England. Now, the problem about this is the only place that they would fund the money for him was Oxford, and it was the Ruskin School of Art. And from there, his future begins, because he was so happy here, happy in England, that when he went back and stayed in America, couldn't bear it, and came back after 4 years. And this is when you meet me. He met me actually originally, briefly, in the 50s, but to be honest with you, I don't remember a word about him. And he came back to the friends that we all knew, and he met me in 1962. And I was older than him, and it distressed me enormously. I was terribly cross when he died before me. It wasn't fair, I was the oldest. Anyway, the point about it is we finally married in 1965. The picture beside it, next to it, is by Thomas Aikens, and it's his wife, Mrs. Thomas Aikens. And this was painted in 1899. The reason I've put those two together is because Aikens was the hero of the Pennsylvania Academy, because he did something very wicked in the 90s. He died in 1917. It allowed women to go into the life room. So he was the hero of all the students of the academy. Now, we lived together in a very strange house in Highbury, New Park, and it was full of Oxford undergraduates. Well, actually, the 4 families were Oxford undergraduates, or graduates in this case. And the reason I'm telling you this is because they become the models for this extraordinary decision that he made when he decided to paint the series of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Now, why? 2 reasons. One, just before that, we'd been to the Whitechapel, and we'd seen Reichenberg's collages, small collages of this same subject. And Bill, of course, wanted to be contemporary. Anyway, the other reason, of course, it was Italian. And what is most important, that Dante was the first Italian to publish a poem in the language. Before this, it had been Latin. So what we're seeing here is it the next one? Yes, we're seeing here. This is Bill painting the Canto 18 in 1965. The reason I put this one on is because behind him, this cluster of people are all the friends who lived in the same house. The one on the next one is frightfully important. This is Canto 20, it's 1966. The figure that's looking at us directly is Dr. August Fry, the Reverend Dr. August Fry. He was another friend from Oxford, and he, like Bill, was an expatriate American. He was born in Chicago. And we met accidentally, actually, in Drury Lane. And they remembered it. They were so excited to see each other. And he became an absolutely important figure in our lives. And what I would remind you, we're looking roughly in 1966. Both of them were expatriate American subjects. And what had happened? The Vietnam War. They both felt pleased that they weren't in it and guilty because they weren't. And so this became almost a weekly discussion about them. And so the next one, which we'll see, I'm just showing you this one because, again, it's one of the people who lived in the house. And she was called Jan Kingsland. And this is Paola and Francesca. And this was painted in 1964. Next to it, you'll see a Utermohlen. And these are the two geishas preparing for a festival. The point about this is that Bill, by this time, could become terribly interested in Japanese art. It was the flat patterns, and particularly the decoration, that interested him so much. And so if you compare these two, you see the decoration of the Paola and Francesca, and that is where he got the stuff from. The background of which is abstract expressionism, because this was the fashionable mode of the time. We then had a most extraordinary thing. He was given an exhibition at the Edinburgh Festival at the Travis Gallery. And this was 1963. And it was at the time of the Cuban Revolution. And there was a wonderful photography exhibition there. And we stayed in a friend's house, and among the other people that were staying there were the Cuban sort of cultural attaches. And we became tremendously friendly with a man called Juan Acocha. He was a writer. He'd actually been Castro's interpreter. He, at the moment, was a cultural attaché in Paris. It was a Cuban cultural attaché. And he fell out of, I don't know really, friendship, difficulty with the revolution, whatever it was, and suddenly he left the revolution, and there he was in Paris, stateless. And the first picture we're looking at is telling us about his condition. And this is Juan sitting in a chair. Next to him is an empty chair with a trench coat over the top. That is describing his particular position. He once said it was absolutely terrifying. He had he was very nervous about it. Suddenly in 1970, he was given French nationality. And this painting is great, great excitement for him. And if you notice, although it's a sort of a reasonably, understandably painted paint, the rest is sort of cubism. And this is because, of course, Bill realized that Cubism started in France, and it was sort of reference to the fact that now he was happy and belonged to France. One of his great friends was a very important, we don't know now, but a very important Cuban writer. And he was called Guillermo Cabrera Infante. And he'd written a book called 3 Trapped Tigers. And it was terribly successful. And he asked Bill to make a painting of him. So what we're seeing is Guillermo and his wife Miriam Gomez, who was also an actress. In front of them is their cat, who is, you'll be interested to name is Offenbach. And this particular picture was painted in 1971. We'd left Highbury New Park and we'd moved to Highgate. And in Highgate, we had a flat. And upstairs, there was a young couple, and they were called the Adam Smiths. Now, their marriage was in trouble. What we're looking at on the right, on the side there, were Chris Adam Smith and his wife, Mary, and the family rabbit, who was called John Silver. Now, you notice they're separated. Now, this is when we begin to look at the way that Bill did portraits. He was less interested in what the people looked like. What he was really trying to tell us about was how they existed, what was their life, what were their interests? And you see a disturbed relationship. On the other side, later, this was 1967, on the other side it's the triptych. And these three are devoted friends, and they are to this day still together. So we're looking at a very comfortable relationship and a very difficult one. Now, in the background, on the left, it's Frank Stanton, who was a painter, and Bill did an example of his work in front of him. Sitting down in the middle was Lee Underhill, who had been an actor but was now an antique dealer. And on the right, on the extreme right, was a young dandy who was called Paul Canati, and he helped run the shop. And so Bill is again describing their relationship and their comfort together. Behind Lee is a sort of a mask. It's an Italian, young man's Italian mask, and it's a reference to his early work as an actor. Behind Paul, there's a sort of swathed Victorian woman's head. Now, something lovely happened in 1969. Amazingly, Bill had an exhibition at the Marlborough. And this seemed to be, it was going to be the beginning of wondrousness. And here we see, the next one we see, of course it was one of the Dantes. In this particular one, it was the Harpy. The reason I put her on is because, again, she was one of these group who lived together in the Highbury. And this was Ginny Fastnage. Her husband, Christopher, was in all the Dantes. He was Dante and thing. And of course, the other one is a photograph of Bill. Now, after this, he came back and he started another series. Now, this series is much more complicated. He's looking back with memory, concern, thinking about his background. What does he do? He decides to paint the one time in their lives that the working class of Philadelphia take over Philadelphia. On New Year's Day, they have something called a mummers' parade. Now, the time that Bill was a little boy, it was only male, it was only white male, and the women presumably made the costume. They had the most ridiculous costumes, and most especially they had overshoes which they painted gold, and they all marched up Broad Street to the tune of Dem Golden Slippers. And Bill, as a young boy, longed to be part of it, but his parents wouldn't let him. But this particular Mummers' Parade became the hidden example of their feelings of Vietnam. Because now we are now in 1970, and Vietnam is worse. He and August Fry are in almost daily concert. They are very nervous about it. And the picture we see here is August Fry, and this particular picture is called There's a Rainbow Round My Shoulder, and this is 1970. And on the other side, again, it is about his own life in South Philadelphia. As a student, going from South Philadelphia to the academy, he was constantly attacked, but stopped by the police. He hated the police. He was very frightened of them. And this is a sort of self-portrait. And it's called Liberty Clown, of course dressed up, notice the golden slippers. And this is, again, is an anti-police case in this bit one. Now, the next one is going to be very important. We'd been to Italy on holiday, and of course we'd gone to Arezzo, and he adored Piero della Francesca. And we were very excited because we actually saw the flagellation of Christ. And the picture you're looking at an example of this picture. Particularly notice the three men on the right. The middle one is the Duke of Urbino. The Duke of Urbino was murdered in 1458. And he became the figures on Bill's, took over the composition. And at the background, you see City Hall. But the three men sitting in front of you, that is a reference to the Urbino, because in the center at the back, the young man is holding a cannabis leaf. And we all know that at that time, it was illegal. Now, the next one is one of the biggest ones. These very large pictures. And this is called The Dance of Death. Now, notice something important. You see the head of Nixon. Now, Kennedy was assassinated in '63. Nixon was a president in 1960. He was a president elected in 1968, and he promised to end the war in Vietnam. The Vietnam war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. And so this is about their mutual discussion about the horror of Vietnam, because you see it was the young, mostly underprivileged men who died in the war, because the wealthy people were able to send their children to Europe, their boys to Europe, to go for the university, and so they avoided going to the Vietnam War. Now, on the other side, you see a photograph of 1965 of these strange men all going to City Hall. Remember that City Hall was the centre of where all the ideas of politics, every social thing was all started there. Now, this really is the biggest and the most interesting of the Vietnam pictures. It's called Old Glory, and of course he's making a reference to Jasper Johns and the flag. But look at it carefully. The top group are an example of Durer's Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And look at the faces of the people in the flag. They are the dying and the dead of Vietnam. And this is no approval of America. Now, something very strange happened. In 1972, he was offered to be an artist in residence at Amherst College. Amherst College was an incredibly expensive school in Massachusetts, and it was only male at that time. The year before we got there, there'd been an absolutely terrible accident. Now, you have to realize that this school was very expensive and very special. But surprisingly, there was a young black student who had passed all the exams, and he was able to get to Amherst College. What they didn't know was that at that time, the local swimming pools were segregated, and he couldn't swim. And one of the last things he had to do was swim in the Olympic pond, a pool which was in the college, and he drowned. And this is the picture that Bill did of the drowned student. And as you see, it's almost a pietà. It's particularly based actually on a Caravaggio. Bill was haunted by this story. And the next year, he did another one, which is called The Pool. But basically, this was the most important thing we did when we were in America. We came back home in '77. We came back to Highgate. And joining us at that point was my young nephew. He was about sort of 12, 15, something that sort of time at that age. And he and Bill got on awfully well. And Bill didn't have a studio there. We decided that we'd make my garage into a studio. And so poor old Simon and Bill had to make the roof not stop leaking and all of this. Bill at this moment was very interested in photography. Particularly, he was fascinated whether or not when a photograph actually captured the essence of a man. So he did this strange self-portrait of himself, half painted, half photography. And on the other side, there's Simon, also half painted, half photography. And they were both 1977. Now, this is when we come to what we're really here for, which of course is the mural. Now, I have to explain something very important. In the late 50s, my mother ran a sort of student place in Oxford, and I met David Goldberg, and he was, of course, a young student, and we became enormously friendly. And over the years, the friendship continued. We were particularly close, well, both families were particularly close in the 60s. And David was so kind and helpful. He knew all about Bill's work. And he knew about the fact that, on the whole, Bill was a narrative painter. And when he had that wonderful possibility of a mural by Irvine Sellers for his dead father Jonas, he came to Bill, and together they decided how it would go. Now, you have to realize that it's terribly complicated. One of the things very important was the various things they wanted to do. One, they wanted to make it look like fresco. So the surface had to be textured. The other thing that was very important, it had to be cheerful. It was about freedom. It was the escape from Egypt. And most importantly, the pair of them were convinced that it had to, as I say, be able to be a story that could be used almost as a teaching experience. And so now Bill has this gigantic problem, who to look at, because after all, it's a very difficult thing to do. So what does he do? We're looking now at the sketch. This is not your mural. This is a sketch for the mural, full-scale sketch. This is important because this is the way that Bill worked, enormously careful the preparation. This particular sketch is almost entirely like your mural. Now, at this particular point, he had to look at an artist that he admired, and of course he chose Nicolas Poussin. And here we were looking at the ones that were in the National Gallery. It's the Adoration of the Golden Calf, and it's 1635, and the other is the Triumph of Pan, also 1636. They were both painted for Cardinal Richelieu, and it was it was really the combination of the people and the landscape that he was looking at. Now we look at rather not marvelous photographs of your old wonderful Montefiore Hall. And this is in the late 70s. So we're now looking at 1981. And here you see the building as it was. And on the right you see the center part of the building, which is going to be tremendously important. Now this is when my dear friend, my ex-student, Elaine Seward, both Bill and I at that time were teaching at the City and Guilds. And Elaine Steele was one of our students. And Bill needed help. This was an enormous, very, very big job. And so she and my nephew, Simon Rees, helped to prepare the mural. So later on, I hope if any of you want to know how it actually happened, Simon is here. And he can tell you actually how it actually was made. And this is what we're looking at now. Now, of course, eventually it is going to be split down. We'll now talk about the mural as it is. Now, here I want you to notice this bit later, because it's rather sweet. On the one side, you see the sketch, and notice that Ruth and Boaz are not very close together. And in the final painting, Ruth and Boaz, i.e., Jonas Sellers and his wife, are Ruth and Boaz gazing at each other. Isn't that nice? And that was what the final one was like. Now, on the other, the next one we're going to see, this was a teaching painting, really. It had to be absolutely accurate. And every part of this mural was discussed and argued. Of course, it was David who helped Bill to decide who and what to put in. And this particular one is the ram's horns, the horn of plenty. And of course, as you know, the ram's horns were made into a musical instrument. What is it called, Camilla?
Shofar.
Shofar. Forgive me.
Right?
but I'm afraid I don't know things like this. And then on the other side, you can see there was two rams, and of course the inevitable cat. We didn't have children; we had cats. And so the next two you see are again details of the Passover. Now, you of course know this much better than I do, but this is all about the escape from Egypt and the firstborn. And there's the firstborn on the tree. And in the bottom, on the left, there's the lamb, Do you see? There's the lamb, and here they all are. And at the back, these are the symbols. I forget it's the 7 symbols. There's barley, wheat, palm. I've got them all written down. Of course, I can't read it now. It's always like that. But they're all in the mural. I'm not. You know this better than me. I'm not doing this very well. But there you go. They're all there. Now the important thing is it's Sukkot. Is that right? Am I saying it right?
Yes, that's Sukkot with the tabernacle.
With the tabernacle. And this is, of course, the end of the one. But notice the tambourines, because what wonderful Elaine found for me was a prophet, the first prophet in Exodus, a woman called Miriam. Now, Miriam, it appears, was the leader of the women when they went into the wilderness, and she noticed the tambourines because she was a dancer, and in all of this mural you'll find the tambourines, and the whole of the thing is telling you about
here are the tambourines
there, and there at the end are the tents, because of course they were in the wilderness for 40 years. But of course it ends with happiness, because what do we see? We see the doves of peace. We see the pomegranates. It's hopeful. This is the point. It had to be hopeful. Now, the next 2 we're going to see, I just happened to say I was very sad about that. This particular one, I put this in because this was me in Doughty Street. I want to really explain the way that Bill did portraits. I'm not going to show many of them. He only really did portraits of people he knew. And this particular one is me in my study in Doughty Street. Now, before I went to America, I was a businesswoman. And then I'd done art history. I did my first degree in England. But in America, I did it seriously, and I got an MA. And I came back, and I decided to teach art history. Now, this painting tells about the change in my life. There I am, sitting with the cats, of course, but surrounded with all the equipment that you need when you're going to lecture about art history. Now, on the other side, we put an example again of the mural. The next one, I'm very sadly, this lady who was not, I was hoping to be here today, but she isn't. And the next portrait showed 2 very important people in our lives. This is Robin Chessex. Now, the interesting thing is he was so interested in the surface that he'd made for the mural that Robin's picture is in the same way. Now yours is mine is too. Sorry, I should have said that. Now she worked for the British Antique Dealers Association, and she's surrounded with all her pieces and her beloved cats. Her cats are Siamese, and they're called Chloe and Casper, and that was painted in 1986. On the other one, and notice the difference in the surface of the paint. This is why I put them together. And this is Christopher Boykos. Now, Christopher Boykos started off as being a student of mine, but later on, he did art history, and he just finished, he was exhausted because he just finished his MA at the Courtauld, and this is when Bill painted him. Now, this became a very important figure because he became Bill's dealer. And so these people are very important to our lives. Okay, the next one. Now, again, we moved to Bill was quite convinced that the East End was going to be the centre of the art world. He wasn't wrong, but I couldn't bear it. That's another point, really. But anyway, we sold the lovely Doughty Street, and we moved to the terrible East End. And this was sort of near Old Street. It was awful. But this particular picture is important because, again, it's another friend, or a colleague, really. And this is Dr. Virginia Button. And she's just finished her PhD. Now, again, the reason I've shown it to you is this. She's surrounded with the work that she would be writing about, and also the things she loved, because there's David Bowie up there in the corner. And what they both, Bill and both she loved was Matisse, and there's a big Matisse there. Now, the other one, we didn't know this woman very well, but she was a single mother. And she had this one little boy who was incredibly lonely. And this picture is called The Hidden Noise. And I think, again, it shows how careful Bill is to describe the condition of the people he was painting. Okay, next one. Now, he had another commission. And this particular one was the Royal Free Hospital. Again, who did he look to? What's he got to, how's he going to deal with the story of a hospital? And he's going to have to use architecture. So again, he goes to Piero, and again Arezzo. And this particular one is a basilica of St. Francesca, and it's a legend of the True Cross. But most importantly, it's the buildings that was important. And the next one we're going to see, of course, is the mural. Now, the mural is the story of how the hospital began. And it was really quite strange because Robert, I've forgotten, William Marsden happened to see a destitute girl on the pavement outside St. Andrews in Holborn. And he decided to start a hospital. And the centre figure you see is, of course, William Marsden. Behind him is the old building where the Royal Free started. And on the outskirts, both of the other two, is the new one, of course, in Hampstead. But in the middle of that, there's another building which is frightfully important because it's the first medical school for women. Now, all through this mural, there's Queen Victoria, and there's all sorts of people which are immense. I've got them all written down, but I can never write. There's Florence Nightingale, there's all sorts of people. As well as this, there are the nurses and the doctors and the occupational therapists who are running, of course, the Royal Free at this particular moment. The next one will show you a few of the details. And here you see Marsden again in the centre. We see at the top the name of the school for women. And here we have the first stone that was laid by somebody called Princess
Christiane of Schleswig,
yes,
Holstein.
And the final one is, of course, the Royal Free. Now, we've moved again. I have won. We've moved from the dreadful East End, and we are now in Little Venice, which is so lovely. And Bill was enchanted because he had a big studio, and the light is extraordinary. There's a canal on the front, and there's lots of space behind it. And we have these huge windows, so there's marvellous light. He painted everything yellow, as you can see. And what we're actually looking at now, we're really looking at the first of the conversation, what Christopher calls the conversation pieces. And we've moved in time. We are now in the late, well, we moved in 89, so we're looking at pictures of 1990. Now, something interesting has happened to his perspective. You notice he's tilted the table up to us. And so we, looking at the picture up, actually part of the painting, do you see? We've moved into it. Now, what are we looking at? We're looking at the things that he loved. He was very good at plants. I was dreadful. I managed to kill the poor man, everything since he died. We have his goldfish, which he loved, and the reflection of the other side. And there is Ginny again. Ginny telling us all about her PhD, waving her arms about, as you can see. And there's me and my friend June Carroll. Okay, this one on the other side, Bill is there but not there because his coat is there. But more importantly, it's his mother's carpet on the floor. He's going backwards, mentally going backwards again. And he's telling us about the ducks outside on the canal and his beloved plants. And there's me, in this particular case, it's me and Robin. Now, the last big one is snow. Now, snow is very big. And this picture describes, again, Little Venice. And we're sitting, you notice we're all sitting around the table, same group. There's Robin, there's me, there's Christopher and the student. And outside it's snow, which is unusual. And there's the puppet barge, which is still there. And if we look on the outer side, we can see the outside of the garden. But what has happened this time? Bill is not with us. He's moved himself slightly away. And behind him is Ginny. Behind him is the portrait of Ginny. But more especially, over the fireplace, it's a portrait of a dear friend who's died. And in front of him, of course, is Robes and his beloved cat. And he's holding little Mitsu. Now, this picture was painted in 1991. And for financial reasons, I took over his studio. He was terribly cross. And I shoved him up into the room upstairs, and he hated it. But luckily, we had these marvelous friends, Robert and Edith Goubet. And they gave him a studio. They gave him a studio in Old Street, next to Edith's studio. And this is when we began to realize that things were not very good, because he managed to get lost. Now, the next one you're going to see here is the only time he did something for a book. And this particular was a series of poems of Wilfred Owens from the First World War. And it's a lithograph, and I've put next to it an Otto Dix, which is again the portrait of the First World War. And we'll come back now to this terrible, because this is really what I was wanting to talk to you about. And this is perhaps the saddest, one of the most saddest pictures. And it was the last big picture painted in Old Street. And this particular one is called Blue Skies. Look at the way he's clutching onto the table for dear life. It's 1995. He's been told that he's probably got Alzheimer's, because, you see, Old Street was quite a long way from Little Venice, and he used to get lost coming back. And so we knew that something was horribly wrong with him, and we started to go to the hospital. And Dr. Rosser finally found out. It was a very interesting series at time that we did this, but poor old Bill. I put two together because, again, this is a self-portrait, but it's in the garage studio that Simon and he built for him in 1977. So we've got 1995 and 1977. The year before was our last holiday abroad, and we went to Rome. And of course we had to see Velasquez Pope Innocent X, and it's in the Doria Pamphili. Now, normally, Bill and I used to go to museums all the time and sort of gaze at them happily, but I'd noticed very sadly that Bill was not paying any attention until we got to this one, and he sat in front of it for a half an hour. He wasn't looking at the Velasquez. He was looking, remembering the Francis Bacon picture of the Screaming Pope. And then he came back and he painted this incredibly sad picture of himself in the studio, screaming with pain. Because, of course, now we knew. We'd been going to Queen Square. He had something called Aricept. It was some sort of medical thing. And we had to go every month. And there was a marvelous nurse there, a man called Nurse Isaacs. And it was he, really, who said to Bill, Bill was always drawing all the time. And he saw him drawing. And he said, why don't you draw yourself? You know, you might be able to tell the doctors more about yourself. And so began the self-portraits. And these are possibly the most extraordinary thing. He was searching for his own identity in the same way that he told the identity of all his sitters. He wanted to find out what had happened to him. And he's looking at himself with such sadness. And these are basically painted between 95 and 96. And as you see, they are more and more and more frightened. The next one, which is the one in the center, and it's the last picture of me. Now, I say, of course, I didn't sit for it. And I do have a shirt, a brown and white striped shirt. And of course, the other one is a very sad portrait. But the most interesting thing that had happened is that his style of painting had changed. Remember all the detail that he did before, enormously difficult. But these were done enormously instantly. It didn't matter whether it was oil paint,
Or
charcoal, anything. It had to be done then and there, and this is what we're seeing. And the interesting thing, I'm doing an art history bit a bit then, you see, I'm thinking that perhaps German Expressionism a bit, I don't know. I suppose it's a bit ridiculous, but here we've got the lovely self-portrait of him in 1955, and the poor, lovely green one of 1997. Now these two, particularly the one with the saw, is very interesting. Dr. Rosser told him that it really wasn't until he died and they could examine his skull properly did they know what really had happened, how Alzheimer's. And he was a bit frightened of this. So you see the saw, it looks like a guillotine. And really, what I want you to notice is the emphasis on the frontal lobe of the head in all of these. This is where he knew his brain was. And he was desperately trying to find out what had happened to me, what had happened to me. And the next one is perhaps one of the most dreadful ones, because this one is one of the last ones. It's a self-portrait with the easel, and he's decapitated himself, really. And each and every one of the facial features are isolated. Look at the size of the ear. The fear is terrible. And the other one, the erased one, was 1999. The final ones I'm going to show you briefly are the wonderful drawings, because the double portrait of the top was in 96. Again, the emphasis on the front of the head, underneath the desperately broken figure. And look at the last one. The eradication of the features. And this is the last one he did. I'm going to finally end with it on a slightly more cheerful note, because this is him in front of a photograph of him in front of snow. And this particular one was 2003. And he's holding a new cat of ours called Saba. Saba died 4 years ago, but she was 24 when she died. And we have her ashes. You will not, he died in 2007, Bill died in 2007. And you will not be surprised when I tell you, wonderful David. Sorry, I'm a bit Bill had a Christian background, but darling David sent him away in the ceremony. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's upset me more than I thought. Thank you. Thank you very much. But if you want to ask questions of the making of the mural, here is Simon, and there is Simon over there, and he'll tell you what it was like to make the mural. There he is, here. Come and tell us, Simon.
Okay. I'm here, obviously, to sort of represent Simon who made the mural. What I want to emphasise that Pat didn't pick up on, but one of the things I remember, actually, sorry. Is that better? One thing I kind of want to emphasise, really, having met him at the age of 7, really, that being an American, his scales were huge. So he was quite used to producing very large canvases. So when we got to the mural stage, the physicality, he did need assistance, like all the kind of traditional painters would have needed. But we were very carefully tutored, because actually behind all of this is an extremely active craftsperson. He was a precise thinker and maker, really. I think it comes from that German background, but he just had that moment. Everything was done very carefully. So whilst we were helping, he was he was almost holding our hands, really. I can show you the bits that I did because I remember them. I wasn't given kind of monumentally complicated bits. I did stripes. That was my thing. I never got onto dots, so I just did stripes. And what he did in view of the canvas, he prepped the canvas using a kind of aggregate so that it was very, very grainy. So when you applied the paint, you had to very carefully drag it. But dragging it was quite complicated because obviously when you first put the paint on it, you had a lot of it. So you had to sort of drag it and stroke it in this very kind of bizarre way. But we were very well tutored. That's all I can say. And as always, it just looks amazing. It's beautiful. And it's held up to time. There was a question about the paint. I personally believe that it was oil all the way through because Bill was he was a very, very, very traditional painter. So it would be very unlikely he'd suddenly get involved with something tacky like acrylic. So I think it's certainly oil. And it wouldn't have lasted in the same way anyway, so... Any questions?
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. I thought you'd like to know how it was made, because poor old Elaine's in Australia, so we can't get her to help. But it was she who put me on to Miriam. I was very grateful. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. It was lovely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Does anyone have any questions, or is there anyone who was here maybe in 1981 when it was first painted who has any memories of the installation?
I would love Mr. Levitt if he would. Mr. Levitt was very kind to me a few minutes ago, and he was responsible for the mural as well. And he told me things about Bill that I didn't know. I didn't realise that Bill knew quite so much about the Bible. Are you there, Mr. Levitt?
Neil's over there. Do you want to say anything, Neil?
You tell them what you told me, my dear. It was wonderful.
Meeting this artist was one of the greatest things I know. He gave me an insight into a world that I had no idea existed, and he will be remembered, as far as this synagogue is concerned, for the marvelous mural that he made, which is now in the entrance to this sanctuary.
Thank you.
I'd perhaps ask Simon, was the whole thing sketched onto the canvas first? In how much detail was the whole thing drawn onto the canvas before you even started painting, or was it constructed as you went along?
Did you remember the first image I showed you? That very, very, we can put it on again, yes. That very complicated image was in fact complete, since he had the detail that he did before he actually went to the final painting.
I would say, though, to add to that there was a redraw. So whilst there was an incredibly precise cartoon made of it, there was a constant reinvention of the drawing, because if he hadn't have done that, it would have been too static. I remember having discussions about this numerous times with the difference between copying something and constantly working on it. So it's heavily worked on.
It was a movement, you see, that he was tremendously excited. The procession. And I really want to emphasize again that I didn't say so, but the clothes were very important. And this is the only bit I actually did have something to do with it, because I said, why don't you look at Vogue? And if you look at the ladies outside, they're all wearing Bieber. And that's really, this is really something that was very important for them, because David and Bill were determined that it should be contemporary. However ancient the story, it had to be contemporary. And my goodness, now, look, we're living through another series of refugees. Isn't it extraordinary? It's so up to date, really, isn't it? You know, the escape to freedom. It's amazing.
Is the idea? Oh, sorry. Could I just ask something? Is the idea of the procession? Was that related to the Mummers Carnival in Philadelphia?
Oh, well, I mean, that's where he first started the idea of a procession. But this particular one, of course, now tell them, darling, it's the Passover, and there's one in the middle.
So, Sukkot.
That's what it's about, you see. And so they're moving, and the end is wonderful because they've got to the promised land. So you see, it's a very hopeful thing, and this is what's important. You know, it's something to be that it was a success. And David was very keen to do this. It had to be, because he felt it had to teach people. This was what it was all about. That help, did? Thank you. Yes, dear.
There is kind of a similarity with them.
Have you made a recording of your visit to the school?
I think that they are making a recording of it, yes.
I don't know what I'm talking about. Camilla makes me work something called Zoom. I sit in front of a computer and talk to it. But I do this all still. And really, without her, I couldn't do it at all. But they're all recorded.
I think that this is recorded.
They're recorded,
yes,
aren't they?
Yes, I'm getting the nod from the back, but yes, this
they're
is
recorded. Thank you.
One piece of information is that Dr. Virginia Button attended our wedding here and walked in and said, "Oh, you've got an Utermohlen on the wall." That was in 1993, because she was a colleague of mine at the Tate. But I have a question about the mural. The cartoon shows the mural as one joined-up piece.
Yes.
It was first installed, it looked like, in the Montefiore Hall split by the architecture, and now it's reunited again. So obviously, your husband, Bill, knew it was going to be split. At least I assume he knew that.
Yes, he did.
And that must have determined how he made the mural.
Yes, he did.
And then reuniting it must have had another impact. Can you say something about that?
Well, yes, we hoped actually to find, we didn't manage to get in touch with him, the person who actually put it on the wall, because I believe it had to be cut at some point, but I don't know where quite. But this is in 91, you see, when it was taken from the old Montefiore and put on this one, and it had to be slightly cut at some places. But I'm surprised how well it survived. It survived very well, considering it's so long ago. You know, for me it's last week, but you know, it is a long time ago. Yes, dear. What would you like to say?
Do you have something to say? No? Okay. Carol, anything to add?
We should thank
Sue. Oh, yes, I must tell you, I must thank very, very deeply Sue and Robert for helping, for doing this. It's lovely.
No, I was just really only wanted to talk a little bit about the private Bill that I knew. And Bill had this amazing talent for being able to make anything and do anything. And when he was in America at Amherst, a patron gave him and Pat some land, and he built a house. I mean, it was extraordinary, everything he did. And it became a sort of joke between the Utermohlens and the Goldbergs. How did Bill know how to do it? And Bill, the answer was, Bill went to the library and got a book. Suddenly, Bill had done chairs, made chairs, all of that, whatever he could do, caning. How did you know how to do it, Bill? I went to the library and got a book. And that was one of the really lovely private things we knew about him, actually, enormously talented at everything, actually.
It's lovely. Beautiful place, this is. Beautiful place.
Patricia, on behalf of all of us, I would just like to say a huge thank you for your talk today. You've given us a wonderful narrative of Bill's life, Bill's art, and the way that the two have meshed together.
Yeah.
And I think all of us, myself particularly, have learnt so much about the art that he created leading up to the mural and indeed afterwards. And as has already been said, we're incredibly fortunate to have this timeless piece of Bill's art in the form of the Harvest Festival's mural, which reminds us every time we come into the synagogue of the vibrancy of our own religion, and to think that Bill has contributed so much to that, so much to our appreciation of these harvest festivals. So on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank you, to thank all those who've been with you and added to this lecture.
It's very kind. I've had a lot of help. And I have to remind you all the time of Rabbi David Goldberg, because without him, it wouldn't have happened.